Hey guys, this is Chris at Highline Guitars, and you're watching another episode from the Luthier's Workbench. First of all, an apology. I know some of you are probably expecting to see part 4 of my Apollyon Floyd Rose build. However, the finish on that guitar is still curing, and before I continue on, I wanted to give it another couple of days and let it cure before I start to do the level sanding and polishing. So hopefully next week I'll continue with part 4. In this episode, I think what I'm going to talk about is kind of inspired by what I'm currently working on while that Apollyon is curing. And that is I'm installing the frets, or about to install the frets, on another Apollyon neck. And that got me to thinking about something which I had said in a previous video, which was if you install the frets correctly, you should be able to avoid having to level and recrown your frets. And of course, when I said that, I got a lot of comments from people who say, no, that's just not possible. You can't do that. Well, I beg to differ. I think it is possible to do that. It's especially true in theory. In practice, however, it does take a little bit of experience in installing frets. But more importantly, it takes an understanding of everything that needs to be done to accomplish this. Now, why do I feel this is important? When you level and recrown frets, what you're doing is destructive. You're removing some of that material, and it's sort of like putting a lot of wear and tear on your frets in just a matter of seconds. So I hate doing that. I just don't like removing the material that I paid for when I bought the fret wire. Now, I know that that's very minimal, but in the end, if you're not careful when it comes to leveling frets, it is always possible to wear some of those frets down to the point where it's almost like you've taken way too much off. And I'm sure some of you have experienced that before. So what I've been trying to do over the years is develop an approach and techniques and skills that would allow me to install the frets so that they install as level as possible. In the end, the only leveling that I might have to do is some very isolated spot leveling. And so far, over the years, I have found that to be a very effective way of doing it. So how do I do this? Well, first of all, it begins with the fabrication of the fretboard itself. And back in the old days when I first started building guitars, we're talking a couple of hundred guitars ago, I was using techniques that I think most everybody uses when it comes to radiusing the fretboard. And I was using radius sanding blocks. Now this is one that I've made myself, and it's got 2 different radius in it. One side is a 12-inch radius, the other side is 16. And I've got several others that range from 7 1/4, 9 1/2, 10. I've even got a 20-inch radius. So I make these myself using my CNC machine because I can make them really long, which ensures a much more accurate fretboard radius. But then along the way, to try to speed up and make the process more efficient, I started using a jig, which I came up with, that allows me to use my router to actually route whatever radius I wanted to use. And I've actually made a video of that jig, and for those of you who might be interested, I'll put a link down in the description below so you can go back and watch that video and see how I made that jig. And that jig worked really well. I could do any kind of radius I want, including compound radius. And it worked, like I said, it worked really well. And then I would radius the fretboard, and then I would go back in and I still had to use my radius sanding block with usually with like 220 grit sandpaper to sand out the tool marks. And then I would cut the slots for the frets. Then I would take the fretboard and I would glue it down to the neck blank, and then I would start to cut the shape of the neck blank with the fretboard at the same time. And that always seemed to work out pretty well. Nowadays, however, I'm using my CNC machine, and with the CNC machine, I can carve the radius, cut the slots, cut the taper, and even drill the marker dot holes, or any inlay design that I might want to come up with. And in the end, the result that I get with CNC is identical to the results that I get if I was doing it by hand. At least that's the goal, is you want the same result as far as the fretboard is concerned. And then I'm ready at this point to start installing the frets. Well, in an effort to try to reduce or eliminate the need for leveling, I found that if I can get a perfect radius carved into my fretboard and then radius each fret wire section and then press it in, I could actually get to the point where there was no need to do any, wholesale end-to-end leveling. Instead, I could finish building the guitar, string it up, set the action, tune the strings, set the intonation, and then play the guitar standing or sitting. And I would play the guitar looking for fret buzz or dead frets, any of those potential issues that can occur when the frets aren't level. And occasionally I would find a fret that might have a high spot, maybe just a little bump, and then I could just work on that little spot rather than doing the whole thing. In the end, I'm removing far less material, I'm saving a lot of time, and I'm preserving all that fret material. The problem I would run into, though, is I found that if I was using nickel silver frets and pounding them in with a fret hammer, there is no way you can get the frets level. There's just no way, unless you do a whole, full-length fretboard fret leveling job. Nickel silver is just too soft, and if you pound it, you can put little dents and dings in the fret wire, which means it's not perfectly smooth radius. It's going to be kind of lumpy, and one fret to the other isn't going to necessarily be level. So you really have to do a full beam leveling of the whole fretboard. On the other hand, if you use stainless steel fret wire, if you radius your fretboard to a consistent radius and then radius the wire to precisely match that fretboard radius, and then you press it in using an arbor press, you can get those frets installed so that they are pretty level. And the surface all the way across each fret is very smooth. There's no bumpy fret hammer dings or anything like that. It's very smooth and consistent. And then the fret wire from one fret to the other is very consistent. And I found that by doing this, I can install all the frets, and they are incredibly level to one another all the way along the length of the fretboard. And then I would, like I said, I would finish the guitar, I would string it up, set the action, tune it, intonate it, and then play it. And I'm finding these days, using stainless steel and a very precisely radiused fretboard, I can actually avoid having to do an extensive leveling and recrowning part of the process. Instead, there are just the rare occasion when I might find a high spot just on one fret, and when that happens, I just work on that little area with my three-corner file and then sand it and polish it. But for the most part, I can get those frets installed pretty level. Now there's a couple of other things that I've encountered along the way in making my fretboards. And one thing that I've noticed recently, and this is just something I thought I would mention, have you ever made a fretboard, radius to fretboard, and then noticed after you cut the taper that the neck seems to be thicker, or that the fretboard seems to be thicker towards the nut than it is at the heel? And that's usually because even though you may have a very precise radius from end to end, there may be because when you cut the shape of the fretboard, that because it's thicker or wider at the heel than it is at the nut, there's more radius in play at the heel than there is at the nut. There's less area here, so as a result, that taper is revealing less of the radius, and therefore it's thicker, appears thicker here than it is here. And the weird thing is if you measure the thickness at the center line, you'll notice the thickness is exactly the same. It's just because you're not exposing as much of that radius here as you are at the heel. It appears to be thicker on the sides. I hope that makes sense. I'm trying to find ways in which to explain this, but you're only going to notice that if you're looking at the fretboard on the side. If you're playing the guitar, you might notice as you're playing, wow, that seems to be thicker at the nut than it is at the heel. I wonder if it's inaccurate. Well, it's not. It is accurate. However, if you want that to be consistent in thickness all the way along its length, what you have to do is you have to generate that radius at a very slight downward angle. And I mean very slight. I noticed this and was able to plot it out on my computer as I was developing the files to do my radius with the CNC machine. And I can actually do that. However, I question the value of actually doing that. Yeah, you'll be able to see that the fretboard gets a little bit thicker towards the nut. And that's going to probably be more obvious in some of the more radically radiused fretboards, like a 10 or a 9.5 inch. A flatter fretboard like a 14, 16, 20 inch isn't going to be as noticeable. But if that really bothers you, the only thing you can really do is to put your radius in at a slightly downward slope from the heel down to the nut. And the problem with that is that means your frets are going to gradually drop down. And in truth, you want them to go down towards the heel in order to reduce fret buzz. However, like I said, it's such a minimal amount. But if you try to sand the edges of your fretboard manually so that it appears to be consistent in its thickness, you're going to end up with a compound fretboard radius. It's going to be more like a 10 inch or 9.5 inch at the nut and then 12 inches at the heel. So that's just something to be aware of. Now, after I have CNC radiused one of my fretboards, and really it doesn't matter how you radius the fretboard, it just has to be accurate, which means if you're sanding by hand, you need to make sure that both sides of your fretboard blank are planed absolutely flat and that the thickness is consistent from side to side in its entire length. Then you want to make sure that you put the fretboard on a dead flat surface, and you don't want there to be any waviness or any bowing or twisting. It has to be laying down absolutely flat. So you're going to want to use a really good, strong woodworker's double-sided tape to hold it down. Then you would sand your radius, and you will constantly be checking. I don't have my radius gauge here with me, but you'd be constantly checking the radius to make sure it's consistent, not just at the nut, the middle, and the end. You want to make sure it's consistent all the way. And then the other thing you're going to need to do is, once you've finished with that radius and you've made your neck and you've got the fretboard installed onto the neck, you're going to want to check the straightness of it with a straight edge. And again, I don't have my precision straight edge, but you would use a precision straight edge to make sure that from the edge to the center to the other edge is absolutely flat. And if it isn't, you can just slightly tweak the truss rod to get it so that it is as flat as you can possibly get it. And you should see no light seeping underneath that edge. Then you would go back and do a final fine-tuned sanding with the corresponding radius sanding block and like a 220 grit. After 220 grit, you can continue sanding like through 400, 800, and you can go up to 2000 if you want to. But after 220, you don't necessarily need to use a radius sanding block, because at those higher grits, finer grits, you're not really going to change the shape of the fretboard. It's just up to 220 that it's really likely going to change as you sand it. But you want to get that fretboard absolutely perfectly radiused, end to end, side to side. As far as compound radius, it's a bit of a different story, and I'm not going to get into that right now. But it's a similar philosophy. You've got to make sure that the radius that you generate, like from a 16 to a 10, is perfect. It can't fluctuate. There can't be any high spots or low spots. So you've got to really do your due diligence to make sure that when you generate that radius, it's been generated precisely. That's the first step. Then the next thing, I recommend using stainless steel fret wire. Now I know a lot of people, I don't like to use stainless steel, it wears out my tools. Well, the whole idea here is we're trying to get away from using those tools and just spot adjust, with in terms of leveling. So I think that stainless steel is just far better, and use of stainless steel is typically what a lot of customers see as a premium guitar. So when you use the stainless steel, you can't radius it the same way that you radius nickel silver, because typically with nickel silver, if you have a 12-inch radius fretboard, you usually would radius it a little bit tighter, so it would be more like an 11-inch radius. That way, when you press it in, those tangs really dig into the fretboard and hold it in better. You can't do that with stainless steel, because if you try to do that, your fret wire is going to pop up out of the fret slot. That's how strong the stainless steel is when it comes to radiusing the wire and then pressing it down. It's got that springiness that you just can't press it out like you can with nickel silver. So you've got to radius the fret wire to precisely match the radius of the fretboard. And I use a fret bender, and this is really the best way to do it. It puts in a smooth, consistent radius in the fret wire, and that way you don't have to worry about facets or an inconsistent, lumpy curvature radius. It's all going to be consistent. Then when I press it in, the final thing I do is this is an arbor press that I use, and it's been modified so that I can use my StewMac fret calls, to press that fret wire in. By pressing the frets in rather than hammering, you get a much more consistent installation of the frets. Also, when I install my frets, I put a little dab of CA glue on the tang, and I just usually apply it. I put one of those pipettes, one of these little pipettes on the end of the glue bottle, and then I just apply a small amount on the tang, and then I press it down in, hold it for a few seconds, and it dries instantly. And that just does a better job of holding the fret down firmly to the fretboard. Now, some people are going to say, well, what about if you have to do a refret down the road? Well, whenever you do a refret, you should always touch the fret wire with a hot soldering iron, and that heat will break the glue. It'll also soften the wood so that it's easier to pull the fret wire out without damaging the frets. So, but if I follow those basic rules, make sure that the fretboard radius is very precisely generated, end to end, side to side. That the fretboard is perfectly straight when I do that, when I generate that radius. And then install stainless steel frets that are radius to match the fretboard, and then press them in with a little bit of CA glue. There's a good chance that when I install this neck, string up the guitar, set the action, tune it and intonate it, that those frets are going to be pretty level all the way from end to end. And if I'm lucky, I won't have to do any work to them. All I have to do really is just dress the ends and then polish them. But I'll still play the guitar up and down the neck, every single string. I'll bend the strings, I'll do everything, looking for any potential high spots, which will cause the strings to fret out or fret buzz. And because I like a really low action, there's a good chance I'm going to get away with not having to do that. Or it may be that if there is a bump or an uneven spot or a high spot or whatever, I can just take my 3-corner file and just grind down that little spot and then round it over and then touch it up a little bit of sandpaper and then polish it out. So, but it does mean that I can get a neck completely finished, or the guitar itself completely finished a lot faster. I don't have to spend a lot of time doing this massive leveling job, which reduces the height of the frets anyways. So that's kind of what I wanted to talk about today, and I hope that makes sense. And I know that I'll probably get some comments from people who, especially the old school guitar techs, who will see this as a way of sort of taking away some of their business or eroding the skills that they spent years learning how to do. But hey, time marches on, and you really owe it to yourself to stay on top of new tips and techniques and tricks and things like that, which can help make it get possible for you to do the work faster and more efficiently, because as you know, time is money. So I'm going to sign out for now and get back to working on this neck, and I'll see you next week when hopefully I'll have part 4 of the Apollyon Floyd Rose build ready for you to watch. So take care.